So at this point, we have seen average, we have seen draw a circle, and we just did a little advanced tour into draw plus. It's time for us to think about really, really helpful functions. And one of those incredibly helpful functions that's just going to be useful no matter where you are in lots and lots of different programs is this particular function isOdd. And there's something I love about isOdd. IsOdd is going to be a function we're going to write, and it's got to take in information. The information it's going to take in is going to be a number. And what it's going to return back to you is a true or false statement. Is that number odd or is it not odd? And that's either a true or a false. So this isn't just a function that returns some information. It's a function that returns a true or false. That's a very special type of function because that kind of function can be used in an if statement or a while loop. Oh, let's go check it out. So I'm going to bring us over back to our IDE, and I'm going to show you guys a function. Now, when we're defining function, it's always good to remember there's two parts. There's the person who uses the function, and then there's the person who defines the function. So let's just focus on the using for now. Here we have a main function, and it loops from 10 to 19. And every single time it's going to take the value I and ask, is it odd or even? So it's going to print out numbers. And if we run it to the end, it'll print 10 is even, 11 is odd, 12 is even, 13 is odd, 14 is even, 15 is odd. You get the point. IsOdd is an incredibly useful thing, but it's not a function that already exists in Python. If you want it, you'd have to define it. If you defined it so that it could take in a number and then return back a true or false, one of the great things is you can use it directly in an if statement. If this function returns back a true, then this if statement will be like, okay, this passed. If this function returns back a false, the if statement will be like, okay, this failed, so we should run this line. So if this function comes back true, we'll print out odd, and if it comes back false, we'll print out even. Seems simple enough. And on some level, we already know how to write functions that can return, so maybe this won't be so bad. Now we've talked about one half. How are we going to use this function? The next half is how are we going to define it? I'm going to take you through a few different versions of defining this function, which go from least elegant to most elegant. And we'll see if we can make this more and more beautiful as we go. Are you guys ready? Should we jump into this definition of isOdd? Here comes your very first version. This version is much more complicated than necessary, but it does work. So if we run isOdd v1, this version actually turns out it only works for values that are greater than 2, but all of our values happen to be greater than 2. And it does the exact same thing that we wanted to. It says 10's evens, 11's odd, 12 is even, 13's odd. Let's look into how it works, though. Let's take one call. At some point, we called isOdd with the value 17. Now, those of you at home can probably figure out what we're supposed to return. Is 17 odd? Yes, it is. So we're supposed to return back true. Let's see if it does that. How does it do its work? It does its work by doing a while loop. And while the value is greater than 2, it subtracts 2. So if it starts out with 17, it goes down to 15, then 13, then 12, 11, 9, 7, 5, 3, and it keeps going until you end up with a number which is no longer greater than 2. If you ended up at 2 itself, we're going to say that was an even number. But we don't, and so we hit this. Now, this is the very first time we've seen a few things. It's the very first time we've seen a function that returns with more than 2 lines. Return's a special keyword. You can use it anywhere in a function. As soon as your function hits the return keyword, it's done executing that version of the function, and it's going to immediately give back the information it's got. So here we're going to immediately give back the value true, which is right because 17 was, in fact, odd. So if you go back here, we had I, which was 17, and then it prints out odd. Let's do this one more time, and this time with the value 18. And I want you to note something very special. We're going to call is odd with 18, and we jump into this function. So when we called it, its name was I, but when we get to the definition, whatever input we're given, we're going to refer to it as value. Really important thing here. Value is 18, but value and I are two different variables. Value is its own variable. It just happens to copy over the old value that I used to have. So we're going to now change value, and I want you to know this is not going to change the value that was passed in, which was the 18 in the I. I is going to remain unchanged while we do our work on value. It's like we got a brand new copy, and we're going to change our copy. So let's go change that copy. We're going to subtract 2 from that copy until eventually we get down to 2. Since it was 2 and we didn't get to 1, we return false. It is not odd. 18 wasn't odd. We return false. Now, when we hit this line, we're not going to execute this line. We're going to immediately go back to where we came. And we immediately go back here. We called is odd with 18. It returned false. So if an if statement fails, if it gets a false, it goes to the else and it prints out even. Huh, that is a wild example. Again, this is going to be included in the lecture materials. Go check it out and play around with it because this covers a lot of cool things. You've got a function which returns a true or false. This function changes value, but even though it changes value, that doesn't affect the value I, because value is a copy of I, not I itself. Yeah, what a wonderful thing. And then we've got 2 different return statements. As I said, though, I was going to walk you through more and more elegant versions of this function. Did you know there's a better way of doing this? Check it out. There's is_odd version 2. And look at it. It's a lot shorter and it's a lot cleaner. Let's look at is_odd version 2. So if we call this function instead, it does the exact same thing, but it does it in a nicer way. Instead of doing this while loop, it just says, hey, value, if I divide by 2, how much is left over? Now, if you don't remember the mod operator, go check out the course reader. The Python reader talks about it. The mod operator says if you divide the left value by the right value, how much is left over? What's its remainder? If that remainder is 1, that means you had an odd number and you should return 2. Otherwise, you had an even number and you should return false. And if we jump into this, let's try it for one value. So 17 again. If you take 17 divided by 2, it's going to be equal to 9 will be what you get if you get 17 divided by 2 with 1 remainder. The mod discards the 9 and just gives you the remainder, and you're left with a 1. And then we say, if that remainder is 1, you had an odd number, so we're going to return true. Again, we're not going to do the else statement. We're not going to hit the other return. We're going to immediately give back true. So 17 was odd. This returns true, which means we're going to jump right into this inside the if statement because the condition was true. And we print out, wait for it, 17 odd. And at this point, you're like, okay, cool. That was a pretty nice, dense example. Can it get any cleaner? And you're like, oh yeah, it can get even cleaner. Both of these two are fine ways to check out is_odd, but I just want to show you what it would look like if a real expert were to write this. If a real expert were to write this, they wouldn't actually use this if statement. This is going to be mind-blowing for a lot of you. But you could have made this whole if statement one line if you wanted to. You could just say, hey, if I check if remainder is equal to 1, that in itself is the Boolean that I want to return. I split this into several lines, but you could have just said, return whether or not remainder is 1. I split into a few lines, though, so we can trace it one step at a time. Instead of using V1, instead of using V2, let's just use this version is_odd. And let's run again. So let's start with a smaller number this time. We passed in the value 10. The first thing we do is we say, hey, 10, when you divide by 2, how much is left over? And it says 0. If you divide by 2, there's nothing left over. And then I check, is 0 equal to 1? This whole thing is a Boolean. And so it gives us back no. To return stores the answer to this equals equals, which is false. And then we return false. One beautiful function that just says, nope, 10 was not odd. So we're going to print out 10 and even. A beautiful, beautiful thing. Anyways, there you have it. So this really is the function that I would recommend you use. Uh, it's just gorgeous. It takes in information, does some calculations, gets a Boolean, and just returns that Boolean directly. A function which returns a Boolean is a gorgeous thing because it can be used in an if statement. An if statement wants something that evaluates to true or false. Since is odd evaluates to true or false, you can use it right there. And there you have it.